The congressional hearing on technology regulation was going exactly as expected, until tech billionaire Elon Musk made a dismissive comment about government oversight that caused Representative Jasmine Crockett to visibly straighten in her chair. What happened in the next 3 minutes left the entire chamber in stunned silence, and may forever change how tech executives approach congressional testimony. Nobody expected anything unusual that morning in the hearing room of the Rayburn House office building. The House Committee on Energy and Commerce had gathered to discuss potential regulations for artificial intelligence and social media platforms. For the first 2 hours, tech executives had delivered carefully crafted statements about innovation, responsibility, and their commitment to working with lawmakers, while subtly suggesting that any significant regulation would stifle American technological leadership. Musk, testifying as both the owner of X, formerly Twitter, and a leading AI developer, had dominated much of the hearing with his characteristic blend of technical knowledge and provocative statements. His confidence was obvious as he fielded questions, occasionally checking his phone when other executives were speaking. When Representative Crockett's questioning time arrived, Musk visibly relaxed, perhaps expecting standard questions about content moderation or algorithmic transparency. Crockett, a former attorney before entering Congress, began with a measured tone. She asked about his repeated statements that his platforms prioritized free speech above all other considerations, wanting to explore how that commitment functioned in practice, particularly regarding content moderation policies. Musk nodded slightly and said that with all due respect, he found that government officials often didn't understand the technical complexities of these platforms. Before they wasted time on hypotheticals, he should note that his companies employed thousands of highly qualified engineers who understood these systems far better than regulators ever could. The dismissive nature of the response drew murmurs from the audience. Crockett paused, studying Musk carefully before responding. The camera caught her expression, not anger or offense, but something closer to calculated assessment, like a chess player who had just spotted an unexpected opening. She replied that she saw his point, but before they continued, she would like to clarify something about her background that might be relevant to their discussion that day. What she said next caused an audible reaction throughout the hearing room, left Musk visibly recalibrating, and transformed what had been standard testimony into a moment that would be analyzed across every major tech publication and news outlet for weeks to come. Elon Musk had long cultivated an image as the quintessential tech disruptor, a visionary entrepreneur who transformed industries through sheer force of will and technical brilliance. His acquisition of Twitter, renamed X, had been positioned as a crusade for free speech against what he characterized as censorious content moderation policies. His approach to congressional hearings typically combined technical explanations with dismissive remarks about regulators' understanding of technology. This strategy had proven largely effective. Most legislators struggled to counter Musk's technical arguments or match his media savvy. His immense wealth and control of multiple influential companies further reinforced his position of strength when facing government oversight. When pressed on specific concerns, Musk typically pivoted to broad statements about innovation and American technological leadership being threatened by excessive regulation. Representative Jasmine Crockett brought an entirely different background to this confrontation. Before entering Congress, she had built her career as a civil rights attorney, handling complex cases that required both legal precision and the ability to communicate complicated concepts to juries. What many observers failed to appreciate was that her legal experience included several high-profile cases involving technology platforms and their impact on protected groups. While other committee members had approached questioning through general political frameworks or prepared talking points, Crockett had spent weeks preparing for this specific hearing. She had consulted with technical experts, studied Musk's previous testimonies and public statements, and most significantly analyzed the actual performance of his platforms against his public claims about content moderation and free speech principles. The stakes of this exchange extended far beyond the hearing room. The legislation under consideration would establish new frameworks for AI regulation and platform accountability, potentially affecting how companies like Musk's operated and their legal exposure for content decisions. The public debate around these issues often centered on abstract principles like innovation versus safety, with technical details and actual platform behaviors remaining obscured. Musk's dismissive comment about government officials not understanding technical complexities represented a common tech industry framing, suggesting that regulators simply lacked the expertise to meaningfully oversee technology companies. This framing had proven effective in limiting regulatory ambition, positioning lawmakers as uninformed bureaucrats, threatening American innovation. What Musk didn't realize was that his assumption about Crockett's technical knowledge had created an opening she was perfectly positioned to exploit, not through matching his technical credentials, but through exposing the gap between his public claims and his platform's actual performance. Crockett began, her tone remaining professional but with a new edge of precision. Before joining Congress, she had spent 5 years representing clients in civil rights cases against technology platforms, including cases involving algorithmic discrimination, content moderation disparities, and Section 230 protections. She had deposed multiple CTOs and trust and safety executives, and she had worked directly with technical experts to analyze platform architecture and content moderation systems. She continued without raising her voice, but with unmistakable clarity, that while she appreciated his concern about wasting time, perhaps they could proceed with the understanding that she might actually comprehend the technical aspects of this discussion. Her questions weren't hypothetical. They were based on specific documented evidence regarding his platform's actual performance versus his public statements. The camera caught Musk's expression shift. The casual confidence was momentarily replaced by a more calculating assessment as he realized this exchange would not follow the familiar pattern of technically naive questions he could easily dismiss or redirect. Musk replied, his tone adjusting slightly, that it was fair enough. What specific aspects of their policies would she like to discuss? Crockett said they should start with the discrepancy between his public statements about consistent content policy enforcement and the documented reality. She nodded to a committee aide who distributed materials to other members while displaying charts on the large screen behind the desk. These graphs represented a comprehensive analysis of content moderation decisions on his platform over the past 11 months, she explained. The data was compiled by independent researchers at Stanford's Internet Observatory and NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics, examining over 16,000 moderation actions. The charts showed clear patterns in how different types of content were treated, with striking disparities based on the political alignment of the accounts and the specific topics involved. She noted that Musk had repeatedly stated that his platform applied the same standards to all content regardless of political viewpoint. How did he reconcile that claim with this data, showing accounts expressing certain political viewpoints were approximately 4.8 times more likely to have content flagged or restricted than accounts expressing opposing viewpoints on the same topics? Musk leaned forward, studying the charts with genuine interest. He said that content moderation at scale was incredibly complex. These patterns could reflect differences in how users express themselves rather than biased enforcement. Crockett acknowledged that was a reasonable hypothesis, surprising some observers with her measured response. However, the researchers had controlled for that possibility by analyzing matched pairs of posts, content expressing different viewpoints but using similar language patterns, engagement techniques, and even identical phrases in some cases. She turned to another exhibit. When controlling for these factors, the disparity not only persisted, but increased to 6.2 times the moderation rate. This suggested the difference wasn't attributable to expression patterns, but to inconsistent policy application. The methodical presentation of evidence was creating an unusual dynamic. Rather than the typical partisan framing or general accusations about bias, Crockett was presenting specific documented patterns that directly contradicted Musk's public claims about his platform's operations. Musk, recognizing the conversation had moved beyond general principles to specific evidence, adjusted his approach. They were constantly refining their systems. If there were inconsistencies, they were committed to addressing them. But moderation. Decisions involved numerous factors beyond what might be captured in this analysis. That brought her to her next question. Crockett continued smoothly. On March 17th, he had tweeted, and she quoted, "At X, we have the most transparent moderation policies in the industry. Every decision is documented and driven by clear rules, not ideology." She looked up from her notes. Yet when researchers and journalists had requested these documented explanations for specific moderation decisions, his company had consistently refused to provide them. In fact, his legal team had argued in court filings that these decision records were proprietary and couldn't be disclosed even during discovery in legal proceedings. Crockett paused, allowing the contradiction to register. How did he reconcile his public claims about transparency with his company's actual practices of withholding the very documentation he claimed existed? The question landed with particular force because it wasn't based on opinion or ideology, but on specific contradictions between Musk's public statements and his company's documented actions. Committee members who had been checking phones or reviewing notes were now fully engaged, recognizing that something substantive was happening. Musk replied, his response notably more careful than his earlier casual dismissal, that their transparency applied to their policies, not necessarily to internal deliberations about specific cases. There were legitimate proprietary aspects to how they implemented their systems. Crockett said she understood the distinction, but his tweet specifically claimed, "Every decision is documented and driven by clear rules." If these documented decisions existed as he claimed publicly, why did his legal team deny their existence in court filings? The question highlighted not just a policy disagreement, but a specific factual contradiction that Musk couldn't easily dismiss or reframe. The room had grown noticeably quieter as the exchange continued to build in intensity and specificity. Recognizing that the specific contradiction about documentation was difficult to explain away, Musk pivoted to broader principles. The larger point was that they were building systems at unprecedented scale. They were connecting billions of people and managing more content in a day than the entire Library of Congress. Some inconsistencies were inevitable in any human system. It was a reasonable deflection, acknowledging the difficulty without addressing the specific contradiction. But Crockett was prepared for this pivot as well. She said that no one disputed the scale challenges. What she was addressing was the gap between his public claims and his platform's actual performance. And this pattern extended beyond content, moderation to user safety features as well. She turned to her final and most powerful exhibit. When he acquired Twitter, he had publicly promised to make the platform safer for users, stating on November 18th that addressing harmful content was his top priority. He specifically mentioned enhanced protections against harassment targeting marginalized communities. The screen displayed a comprehensive analysis of harassment reports before and after Musk's acquisition. This analysis by the Digital Forensic Research Lab examined over 400,000 harassment reports from the year before his acquisition compared to the year after. It found that under his leadership, response time to harassment reports increased by 563% on average, and the percentage of reports resulting in any moderation action decreased from 22% to 4.6%. The specificity of the numbers made them difficult to dismiss as partisan framing or general criticism. These were concrete metrics that directly contradicted Musk's public commitments. For certain categories of harassment, specifically those targeting transgender users and racial minorities, the decline in responsiveness was even more pronounced. Crockett continued. Reports of targeted harassment against these groups received moderation responses in only 1.7% of cases under his leadership, compared to 34% before his acquisition. She let the statistics register before delivering her most devastating point. Her concern wasn't about his political views or even his vision for the platform. Her concern was that he had repeatedly made public commitments about safety, transparency, and consistent rule enforcement that his own company's actions directly contradicted. This wasn't about politics. It was about truth in advertising and corporate accountability. The framing was masterful, shifting the issue from ideological debates about content moderation to straightforward questions about corporate accountability and false claims. This approach transcended typical partisan divisions, focusing instead on whether a company leader should be held accountable for promises made to the public and shareholders. Musk, recognizing the substantive challenge before him, paused before responding. When he did, his tone had shifted notably from his initial dismissive confidence. He said he appreciated the detailed analysis she had presented. While he might question some of the methodologies, the trends she had identified deserved serious consideration. He maintained that their goal was consistent enforcement and improved safety, but clearly, there was a gap between that goal and their current performance that they needed to address. It wasn't a complete concession, but it represented a significant shift from his initial posture, an acknowledgement that specific evidence had raised valid concerns that couldn't be dismissed through general statements about innovation or technical complexity. Crockett, recognizing this shift, responded not with triumph, but with constructive engagement. She appreciated that acknowledgement, because ultimately the goal wasn't to criticize technology companies, but to ensure they delivered on their promises to users and the public. She closed her questioning period with a statement that would be widely quoted in subsequent coverage. When he made public commitments about how his platform operated, whether regarding safety, transparency, or consistent rule enforcement, those statements mattered. They shaped user expectations, influenced investor decisions, and impacted public discourse. If there was a gap between those public commitments and actual performance, addressing that gap wasn't government overreach. It was basic corporate accountability. The comment landed with particular force because it reframed the entire regulatory discussion. Rather than government imposing arbitrary rules on innovative companies, Crockett had positioned regulation as simply holding companies accountable for their own public claims, a framing that resonated across political perspectives. Within hours of the exchange, clips began circulating widely across both traditional and social media platforms. What made the confrontation particularly compelling wasn't partisan gotcha moments, but the substantive nature of the evidence Crockett had presented and Musk's eventual acknowledgement of its validity. Tech publications that typically covered congressional hearings as political theater devoted unusual attention to the specific data Crockett had presented. One analyst wrote that what made this exchange remarkable wasn't political framing, but specific metrics that directly contradicted public statements. It was rare to see congressional questioning that directly engaged with platform performance, data rather than abstract principles. The hashtag receipts, not rhetoric, began trending as viewers shared clips of Crockett, presenting specific statistics that contradicted Musk's public claims. Political commentators across the spectrum noted how the exchange had shifted the framing of tech regulation. Debates. A conservative columnist observed that Representative Crockett had accomplished something significant by focusing on corporate accountability rather than ideological arguments about content moderation. Whether you believed in minimal or substantial tech regulation, the basic principle that companies should be held accountable for their public claims was something most Americans agreed on. Progressive analysts similarly focused on how the specific evidence presented had cut through typical talking points about innovation versus regulation. When the discussion moved from abstract principles to documented disparities in platform performance, it became much more difficult to dismiss regulatory concerns as naive or anti-innovation. For Musk, the aftermath presented both challenges and opportunities. Initially, some supporters defended him by questioning the research methodologies Crockett had cited, but as technology journalists examined the studies in detail, their methodological rigor became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Several Prominent tech analysts confirmed that the research met industry standards for data analysis and had appropriately controlled for potential confounding variables. 3 days after the hearing, Musk addressed the exchange through a series of posts on his platform. He noted that congressional hearings rarely featured substantive discussion of platform metrics. Representative Crockett's preparation and focus on specific data was a welcome change from typical political theater. While he maintained that content moderation at scale posed unprecedented challenges, the disparities she identified were concerning and deserved investigation. In a subsequent post, he announced that his company would conduct an internal review of moderation patterns and response times to harassment reports, with results to be made public within 60 days. They were committed to improving their systems and ensuring their public commitments matched their actual performance. This response generated its own wave of commentary, with many observers noting the rarity of seeing a tech executive acknowledge valid concerns raised during congressional testimony rather than dismissing them as uninformed or politically motivated. For Crockett, the impact extended beyond this single hearing. Her office reported a significant increase in engagement from both technology experts, offering further research, and congressional colleagues seeking consultation on effective oversight approaches. Several committee chairs reached out to discuss how her evidence-based questioning model might be applied to hearings in other domains, where technical complexity often shielded companies from effective accountability. The broader impact on tech regulation discussions was particularly notable. In the weeks following the hearing, several major news outlets published analyses examining the gap between tech companies' public statements and their platform's actual performance. This coverage moved beyond the typical focus on political bias, allegations to more substantive questions about accountability for public commitments. 6 months later, the exchange continued to resonate in concrete policy developments. When the committee released its draft legislation on platform accountability, it included specific provisions requiring technology companies to provide documentation supporting public claims about content moderation practices, safety features, and algorithmic fairness, provisions directly inspired by the issues Crockett had raised. Within the technology industry itself, the exchange prompted meaningful reflection about the relationship between public statements and actual platform performance. Several major companies proactively released more detailed metrics about their content moderation practices, harassment response times, and policy enforcement patterns, a move widely interpreted as attempting to avoid the kind of scrutiny Musk had faced. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange created space for more constructive engagement between technology leaders and regulators. By focusing on specific, measurable aspects of platform performance, rather than abstract principles or ideological framing, Crockett had established a model for oversight that could potentially transcend partisan divisions. As one technology policy, experts summarized a year later, the Crockett-Musk exchange represented a potential turning point in how we approach technology regulation. By focusing on corporate accountability for public commitments rather than abstract debates about the proper role of government, Representative Crockett created a framework that could appeal to both those who prioritized innovation and those concerned about platform harms. The result wasn't immediate consensus, but something perhaps more valuable, a shared factual foundation for discussions about how these platforms actually operated versus how their leaders claimed they did. This incredible confrontation shows what happens when someone comes prepared, with actual evidence instead of just talking points. Jasmine Crockett didn't try to out-tech Elon Musk or score political points. She simply held him accountable for his own public statements with hard data that couldn't be dismissed. The way she systematically presented evidence that contradicted his claims, then offered him a chance to address the gaps, created a completely different dynamic than the usual political theater we see in these hearings. Most importantly, her approach showed that effective oversight isn't about being anti-technology or anti-innovation. It's about making sure companies actually do what they promise to do. When powerful figures make public commitments about safety, transparency, and fair treatment, those words should mean something. The fact that Musk eventually acknowledged the validity of her concerns and committed to internal changes proves that this evidence-based approach can actually work to create accountability, even with the most powerful tech leaders. If this story made you think about corporate accountability and the importance of backing up claims with evidence, like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more coverage of moments when preparation and facts triumph over spin and empty promises.